Hello, the Divine Code reading for November 11th, pages 313 and 314. We are in the chapter, The Prohibition of Separating Meat from an Animal that is living or in the process of dying, and restrictions on consuming such meat after the animal's death. Topic number 2. From this verse, Genesis chapter 9, verse 4, we know that as long as an animal's soul is in its blood, it is alive, and it is forbidden to remove any part of it to eat. This applies even if the animal is sick and has signs of terminal illness. There are specific signs of terminal illness or injury that render a kosher species of an animal forbidden for Jewish consumption. The animal is killed by the procedure of kosher slaughter. In Hebrew, this animal or bird this is called an animal or bird that has become a treifa. So the term treifa within Jewish dietary halakkas, Jewish dietary laws, is an animal that, due to some kind of an injury or disease, is sort of in the process of dying over the next over the next 12 months. If the animal is in this state where it has some kind of disease or injury that will cause it to die in 12 months, it's considered treifa and would not be permitted for Jewish consumption. Therefore, there's not a lot of laws that have been developed to understand what to do with such meat, because it's not permitted for the Jew. For the non-Jew, which is what we're studying here, it would still be in the category as a regular animal. The non-Jew is not affected in what he's allowed to eat if the animal's treifa. So if the animal has, in the Jewish law, they will slaughter the animal, and then they take apart the animal and they check different parts of the animal to make sure that the animal was healthy at the time it was slaughtered. That's important for the Jewish dietary laws. It's not important for the non-Jewish dietary laws, and therefore the non-Jew would not be concerned with that. Therefore, the laws of treifa would not affect whether or not the limb of a living animal it would not have a factor in that. If the animal's treifa, it would still be under the laws of the prohibition of eating the limb of a living animal. This can be learned from the case of one who cuts off an animal's limb and thereby causes the animal to become a treifa. In Hebrew, the Hebrew term for an animal that has a fatal disease or injury, as cited by Rambam in the Laws of Forbidden Foods 5.5, as explained above in topics 2.4. So, if the animal, from the Jewish law, apparently from the Jewish law standpoint, if the animal had a limb severed off, that might put it in the category of being treifa. But it would not affect the rest of the animal. The part of the animal that was cut off would be prohibited, but the rest of the animal would still be permitted for non-Jewish consumption. And that's where they're learning that the non-Jew is not affected by treifa. It also applies even if the sick animal has become so morbid that death is imminent. For the animal is still deemed alive, so long as there is even the slightest amount of life in it. A deathly sick creature is still considered to be alive. See Shulchan Aruch Yeridea, chapter 339, and Tractate Kulin 30a and 37a. So in the case of Jewish consumption, a creature close to death cannot be slaughtered and then eaten for meat because that would be treifa. But it would be permitted for a non-Jew because because of this, the limb taken from such a creature would be considered limb taken from a living animal, even if it's very close to if the animal was going to die anyway in a few minutes, even, it would still be considered limb of a living animal at that point. The difference between deathly sick and morbid from the disease of old age and in the throes of death after being slaughtered for food. So they're looking at the category of an animal that is close to death for natural or so in this case they're looking at from natural causes. The animal that's close to death for natural causes and the animal that is in the throes of death, that means it was slaughtered for the sake of food. Those are the two categories we're looking at. Is that the sick animal, the animal dying for natural causes, became stricken without human intervention and is dying naturally. Whereas if an animal is still convulsing after being slaughtered for food, its dying process has begun in a way that is permitted for a Gentile to have caused. This is also found in Tractate Sanhedrin 78a in Rambam, the Laws of Murderers 2:7. Nevertheless, if this death-causing act happened even naturally, that is from an animal of prey, or that would be an example of how the death-causing act, it is in the beginning of the death process. So clearly there's a distinction between the animal that's dying naturally from natural causes, that's a disease or old age, and the animal that is slaughtered for food. We have this other category that is in the an animal, a coyote got into the chicken coop and was tearing apart the chickens. The chickens are in the process of dying. The farmer chased away the coyote, and the chicken is laying there in the process of dying. It's in the beginning of its death process. And it's unclear in the footnote here which category that would fall into. This becomes important in the next part, where there's apparently a difference in the halakkas as to an animal that is dying naturally versus an animal that is in the death throes after being slaughtered. Let's say the throat was cut, the neck was cut to the point where death is imminent, but the animal's still moving about, and so the question is between these two categories. Thus, a Gentile who knowingly eats aver memakai that is severed from a living animal when it is morbid or when it has terminal illness or injury. So I would assume that the animal that the chicken that was attacked by the coyote and the chickens in the process of dying would be in the category of terminal illness or injury. Is liable for capital sin if the meat is taken before the animal dies. If the meat is eaten, if the meat is eaten before the animal dies. However, this rule regarding dying animals applies only when the animal becomes stricken by natural cause, for example, from an old age or disease. So the case of the animal that's from old age or disease, if the meat is taken from the animal while it's still alive and it's eaten while the animal is in that state in the process of dying from the old age or disease, that would be a capital sin. That's a full, complete Torah violation. It'd be a capital sin in a court. The situation is different if the animal becomes morbidly injured through an action which can kill it, from which it will not survive. This applies whether the action was done by a human, for example, if the human slaughtered the animal, or whether it happened through divine intervention. For example, a ferocious creature pounced on it and broke its collarbone, or if it fell or became fatally injured, as will be explained below in topic 11, maybe in a couple days. For example, if it fell and both its windpipe and esophagus gullet were cut, if in one respect, a similar rule applies, that it is forbidden forever to eat from flesh that is severed from such an animal while it is in its death throes. So, okay, so apparently the animal, the chicken that is in the process of dying after being attacked by a coyote would be in this category of one that's injured by falling on a fence or something, or one that is killed by human or is in the process of dying from after human slaughter. So animals that either that are dying by some kind of injury, whether it's a human that's slaughtering it, or if it's an animal, or if it's some other kind of an accident. These are in a separate category from the animals that are dying by natural causes. So in one respect, it is similar. A similar rule applies that it is forbidden forever to eat the flesh that is severed from an animal while it is still in its death throes. However, one who eats from a dying animal in such a condition while it is still convulsing before its death is not liable for a capital transgression if it resulted from an external action such as those cited. So, if the animal is dying by natural causes, old age or disease, then the animal is considered, it's fully considered alive until it actually dies. And meat severed and eaten at that time would be a capital sin. However, if the animal dies by unnatural causes, an accident, an attack by a wild animal, or by human slaughter, it's in the process of dying. It's going to die within seconds, or in a very short period of time. But still, in that period of time, if a piece of meat is taken off the animal at that point and it's eaten, it's forbidden to do so. But this is by rabbinic decree, by the sages decreed it such. But it would not be a Torah violation that would result in a capital sin, in a capital case, in a court. So it's different, depending on how the animal dies, or is in the process of dying. Radvaz explains on Rambam Laws of Kings 9:13 that the prohibition of Abraham and Makkah is composed of two types of actions. One, the prohibition to sever and eat meat from a living animal. Two, the prohibition to eat meat that was severed from a slaughtered animal that was still convulsing while it was in the throes of death. Since a Jew is supposed to is allowed to cut off meat from a kosher slaughtered animal as soon as its esophagus and windpipe have been properly cut through, a Gentile may surely do so. So if it's allowed for a Jew to do this, and the Jews have more stricter laws, generally speaking, than a Gentile, therefore, because it's allowed for a Jew, it's assumed to be allowed for a Gentile. Likewise, according to Torah law from Mount Sinai, a Gentile may cut off flesh from a fatally stabbed animal while it is still convulsing in its death throes, if this flesh will not be eaten until the animal dies. However, the early Torah sages forbade a Gentile to do this, as it might lead to eating from the severed meat while the animal is still convulsing before its death, or even to eating avermimici in other situations, which is forbidden. It is logical that such a mistake could easily be made, for the commandment, "Do not rule over animals to afflict them," applies only while the animal is still alive. But the Gentile could assume that it would be considered that he is severing meat from the dead animal, since the animal is nearly dead, and it would be allowed for him to eat this meat. So it's unclear from what's being said here whether or not the meat. This is a very specific case where it's almost impossible for this to happen. But if it did happen, there are certain cases which are on such a theoretical level, but they're still important for studying Torah. So the case of a person who takes a piece off the chicken, which was attacked by a coyote. The chicken's in the process of dying. The death is imminent. The person takes a piece of the chicken and consumes the chicken while the chicken is still alive. Would that be considered a death penalty case in a Torah court? And apparently it is forbidden by the Torah, from what's being said in footnote 41, for him to consume that meat, but it would not be a death penalty case. So there's some that implies that there's some serious question as to whether or not it's actually a Torah prohibition, because otherwise it would be a death penalty case in that case too. So there's some reason why it would maybe more an edict of the sages for that to be forbidden. And that gets more into tomorrow's reading, where it goes into the question of kosher slaughter, whether or not that would be permitted or not, or prohibited by Torah law. But finishing up today's reading, accordingly, if a Gentile slaughters an animal in any way, it is forbidden to cut off meat or sever an organ while the animal is in its death throes. And any meat or organ severed at this time is forbidden to be eaten forever, even if the slaughter was performed by a Gentile in the ritual Jewish manner of next slaughter. Since it requires spiritual dimension for actual kosher slaughter, the process called shita in Hebrew can only be accomplished by a sufficiently Torah observant Jew. And there's actually a lot of there is questions about that also, but this is the way the Divine Code has taken the stricter stand on this area, whether that's the Torah law or a rabbinic requirement by the sages said that it needs to be a Jew that does the slaughter, is a question that is debated in the yeshivas and debated amongst Torah scholars. But the general rule is that it needs to be a Torah observant Jew that does the shita. And the idea that the meat is forbidden forever is also a fence. It's a rabbinic fence to prevent the acceptance of such meat. And I really think that halakhic works needs to come with color coding, so we know what's actually Torah, the Torah law, and what's the sages, and what's the rabbinic fences, and where the disputes are. I would advocate for Shulchan Aruch to come with a color coding of some kind. But we'll go more into this into tomorrow's reading, where it expands it, and it goes into the question of an actual kosher slaughter, and whether or not such meat is acceptable in that case. Thank you.